For decades now, people have been attempting to cross the US-Mexico border. However, in recent years, people seeking refuge from unstable Central and South American countries, most notably Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, have been crossing the border in hopes that they can improve their lives and the lives of their families. They do this by attempting legal asylum. According to U.S. and international law, a person can seek asylum from the U.S. under certain qualifications. First off, a person has to fit the legal definition of a refugee. International law states that, because access to full protections can be a lengthy process, a refugee is anyone fleeing violence or danger in their home country. Protections are supposed to be given to anyone seeking refuge out of a country. Secondly, in the case of the U.S., a person cannot seek asylum legally without first entering the U.S. There's a couple ways a person could do this. You could either A, get onto U.S. soil physically, find border enforcement, and claim asylum, or B, you can seek asylum through a legal port of entry, such as an airport or a border crossing. Seems pretty easy, right? Well, yeah, that's because it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be that if someone is in imminent danger, by simply living in their home country, that if they seek asylum in the US, they can get protection while judgment is being made on their asylum case. However, in recent years, these protections have been rolled back in the US. There are a couple of written policies that have affected how asylum seekers can seek asylum in the US. In 2017, the Trump administration released the Migrant Protection Protocols, or Remain in Mexico, which required anyone seeking asylum along the southern border to stay in Mexico while waiting for their court date. While this and the equally destructive Title 42 were overturned, President Biden's administration brought around the asylum ban, which banned anyone who had crossed a border and did not apply for asylum in that country that they entered before seeking asylum in the U.S. For example, if you were from Guatemala and you went through Mexico and didn't apply for asylum in Mexico, you could not apply for asylum in the U.S. due to the fact that you crossed the Guatemalan-Mexican border and not first apply for asylum in Mexico. There was one option, though. You could try to secure an appointment through the mobile app CBP One, which has a very limited number of seats. But deaths along the border have been occurring for a far longer period of time, and that is due in large part to a Border Patrol policy implemented in 1994 called Prevention Through Deterrence. The idea of prevention through deterrence is to make it far harder for asylum seekers to cross the border and gain, or at least claim, asylum, making the risk far higher than the reward, and subsequently lowering the number of asylum seekers and apprehensions by Border Patrol. In this effort, Border Patrol doubled the number of agents along the southern border twice, and advocated for more technology, funding, and the construction of the border wall. It is also oftentimes the case that Border Patrol agents on the ground simply turn back asylum seekers into Mexico. The main point is that prevention through deterrence works to push desperate people away from safer routes. And so, asylum seekers turn to far more dangerous areas, such as the Sonoran Desert. The Sonoran Desert stretches across northern Mexico and into southern Arizona, and makes up one of the most treacherous locations in the United States. It is also one of the hottest deserts in the United States, with average highs going up to the hundreds in summer months. It is no surprise then why a large number of people die across the U.S. border in this region. Because of this, in Pima County, Arizona, there has been a concerted effort to identify the remains of undocumented migrants who perished in the harsh environment of the Sonoran Desert. Much of the work is being done using forensic anthropological methods, which are used to identify the remains and return them to families. The first step involved is to identify whether or not remains actually belong to those of an undocumented migrant. The Pima County Medical Examiner's Office, which is the main center that handles migrant remains and their identification, actually has a distinct profile to determine migrant status, the Undocumented Border Crossers, or UBC profile. The profile includes the location the body was found, racial indicators, and any documentation on the body to indicate nationality. There's also osteobiological evidence that can be used to corroborate whether or not remains belong to asylum seekers. Far more likely than not, asylum seekers come from impoverished communities and backgrounds, which leave traces on people's skeletal remains. These traces include poorer dental health, overall shorter statues, higher instances of poorly healed fractures, and skeletal indicators of nutritional stress. These indicators are super helpful in identifying remains as those of migrants, since, as we'll talk about later on in the video, a lot of the remains found in the Sonoran Desert are skeletonized. Archaeological evidence is also super important for determining the migrant status of recovered remains. Remember, the vast majority of migrants trying to enter the US are bringing their whole lives with them, and so they're bringing documents such as identification records, medical history, and records of violence against them, such as police incident reports. These are especially important if refugees are trying to seek asylum through the US legal system, as these documents can provide a basis for an asylum claim in a legal court, demonstrating that they are unsafe in their home country. There is no singular way that migrants perish out in the Sonoran Desert. I won't go into every possible way, but some of the most common are dehydration and exposure to the elements, whether it be the day's heat or the night's cold. Remember, this is a desert. If you watching this want a far more in-depth picture, I would suggest reading Jason De Leon's book Land of Open Graves, or Naming the Dead by Reineke. Not a book, a paper, but still. Both of which were extremely crucial in my research, and both are linked or sourced in the description below. You can also take a look at the Humane Borders Migrant Death Map, also linked below, an interactive map of all recorded migrant deaths stretching all the way back to 1981. The important thing to take away from all this is that the deserts of the southern border are an extremely violent place. Forensic anthropologists trying to identify the remains of migrants use a biological profile in addition to the UBC profile. This biological profile identifies estimated age, height, ancestry, and sex, and is an invaluable tool in trying to narrow down the identity of the person that the remains found once belonged to. The Pima County Medical Examiner's Office also has to determine the way in which a person perished, natural, accidental, homicide, suicide, or undetermined, for medico-legal purposes. One major factor that causes problems for the identification of remains is the Sonoran Desert itself. Remains that are not found within a week of the victim's death are often degraded by the elements or natural scavengers, or both. In a study done by Jason De Leon and his team, and recorded in Land of Open Graves, dead pigs were dressed and left out in the Sonoran Desert. The longest it took for vultures to find, skeletonize, and scatter the pig remains was 17 days, and De Leon suspected it was only due to early summer rains. While grim, it's important for us to know, in order to understand that remains, A, will not always be easily identifiable and or intact, B, may never be discovered at all, depending on the time, situation, and location, making death tolls probably higher than confirmed accounts. Still, forensic anthropologists have a large number of tools at their disposal to help make identifications. All migrant remains found that can go through an autopsy must, in accordance with medical legal procedures. The remains are first examined externally and photographed before the autopsy actually begins, with the classic Y-shaped incision being made down the trunk of the body. The organs are taken out, examined, and weighed, and the brain is also revealed and examined. And then everything is placed back into the body. However, due to the conditions of the Sonoran Desert, many of the remains are found skeletonized or mummified. This is when forensic anthropologists truly come into play. You see, technically it's forensic pathologists who perform autopsies, but when skeletonized remains come in, forensic anthropologists take over. Because Pima County has such a high number of skeletonized and mummified remains, the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office actually has a permanent forensic anthropologist position. When it comes to skeletonized remains, identification relies heavily on what skeletal elements remain in what condition. The most important bones for identification and analysis are the cranium, which is basically your skull minus your jawbone, the pubic symphysis, which is a part of your pelvis, which is used to estimate sex, the femur, which is used to estimate height when remains are not intact, and the fourth rib. These can be used to put together a biological profile of an individual, though a far more broad one than non-skeletonized remains would give investigators. Due to the hot and dry conditions, mummification of remains is also extremely common, in which case forensic anthropologists have tools such as infrared photography to look for potential tattoos that can be used for identification, or the rehydration of hands to get fingerprints. But Basil, you might be saying, why can't they just do a DNA test? They do. Bone samples provide DNA, which in turn is crucial for getting a positive ID on remains. However, the practices I've just described give investigators parameters around which they can more easily identify who, out of those who go missing crossing the Sonoran Desert, the remains belong to. So, why does this matter? Well, for one, this matters on a social aspect. Despite the fact that prevention through deterrence has been a Border Patrol policy for 30 years now, the number of asylum seekers coming across has risen, and people will continue to cross. The people who feel the need to cross through dangerous, deadly deserts in order to enter a country are doing this out of necessity, because going back to their home country is not an option anymore. What forensic experts and social justice workers do when they identify the remains of those who have perished and keep accurate records of dead is present a picture that can be used, or, should I say, should be used, to better inform us of the situation. This is important especially because Border Patrol is notorious for undercounting migrant deaths along the border. According to a 2022 article by Ryan Devereaux in The Intercept, in 2020, when the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office documented 206 migrant remains recovered, the Tucson Sector Border Patrol, which covers the same area of land, documented only 42. Overall, comparing both organizations, medical examiners have counted twice the number of remains as a Border Patrol. But just as importantly, the family of those who have died deserve closure. While forensic anthropologists still work to identify the remains of those who have died trying to seek better lives, more people will still keep dying. More families will lose family members, and many will never know what happened to loved ones.